Great.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane, and I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library. I'm really thrilled to be here with Anders Gyllenhaal. And unfortunately, his wife Beverly could not be here tonight because, you know, stuff's going around. So we miss her, but we will have an excellent conversation with Anders. Before we get started on his talk about his and Beverly's book, A Wing and a Prayer, I just want to say a couple things. One is I'd like to thank the Friends of the Ashland Public Library who support all of our programming. I'd also like to thank Anders and Beverly who allowed us to partner with some other local libraries, because when libraries get together, of course, we make magic. So really pleased to share this program with some other communities and libraries. You can buy signed books from Anders and Beverly from Aesop's Fable. I will put the link in the chat. And of course, you can get them from your local libraries, which you're all going to want to do as soon as this talk is over. Anders has a 30 to 40-minute presentation. We're going to take questions afterwards. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A at any time, and I will moderate them to Anders at the end of his presentation. So without further ado, this is really interesting. A Wing and a Prayer is written by, journalists Anders and Beverly Gyllenhaal. They've traveled 25,000 miles across the Americas to write this book and learn about avian conservation and their own taking their passion for birds and, again, conservation and saving them, to finding grassroots initiatives to make sure birds survive all kinds of things. So I cannot wait to hear everything Anders has to say, and I will have lots of questions for you afterwards. Welcome, Anders. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you, Mina. Thank you all for joining us this evening. It's a great pleasure to talk about our book. It's our favorite thing to do, and to talk about our travels. And it's a topic that has taken us to a lot of library groups, and so we really came to appreciate the ability to talk with you. The book, as Mina said, is about the passionate cast of characters, and that includes scientists and birders and wildlife experts and hunters and ranchers and philanthropists that are working to save birds at what I think you all know is a really fragile time, because we're at this extraordinary juncture at this moment, because two opposing forces are at work at the same time when it comes to birds. One is this enormous pressure that's eroding more than half the species in North America. Think about that. That's a startling number. At the same time, there's this whole series of responses to those pressures, innovative ideas in conservation, some of which we'll be talking about here and we delineate in the book, a whole series of promising new technologies, and a really long list of rescue missions that are going on all across the hemisphere. At this moment, the technology of bird study is advancing at a head-spinning and really encouraging pace, at the same time as new ideas are emerging about basically how can we coexist with birds in a time of a lot of environmental disruption. And that's why we in the book call it a race. Which of these forces is going to prevail? We're convinced that really this next 10 years, after talking to more than 300 people about this, is going to be pivotal. As Elizabeth Gray, who is the CEO of the Audubon Society, puts it, we have about a decade to get this right. I want to emphasize at the very start that we're not scientists, we're not experts. We might not even be the best birders on the call tonight, but we're journalists, storytellers. Both of us spent our careers in various forms of that, and when we found this story, we wanted to try to translate the breadth of what's going on out there to in a form that will reach and resonate with just all kinds of people. And obviously we have been captivated ourselves with birds. We're in awe, I think, of their amazing mechanics, as I'm sure many of you are, their beauty and their critical role. And I want to just take a minute to think about this, their critical role as nature's workhorses. We're learning, along with everything else we're learning about birds, steadily more about the intricacies of how birds pollinate plants, this this hummingbird, a tiny little wisp of a bird, of course, of various hummingbirds pollinate more than 8,000 species of plants, and how they consume insects. 500 tons of insects are consumed by birds each year. Those are bugs that now are not biting us. They fertilize the forest and grasslands, and vultures and other birds, they clean up nature's refuse, and they spread seeds and the results of that across forests and grasslands. So there's a really important role that we're understanding, and I think coming to appreciate more and more as the information becomes more readily available. We ourselves got hooked on birds, more than about 12 years ago. We were living in downtown Washington, D.C., surrounded by concrete and high-rise buildings. We started to try to get out of the city on the weekends. And although we both grew up, aware of birds and what they were, we knew bluebirds, of course, and cardinals. And these are photos that that tell you how beautiful these birds are, owls. But we didn't know what a lot of the birds we were seeing were. So I think as many birders have come to this, we just started to explore it and try to figure it out. And this was before you had Merlin or eBird that could help you figure out what birds you were seeing were. We would spend time shooting the birds, and these are a lot of the photos that you'll be seeing during the day, and then going back and going through the guides at night, and gradually got us more and more interested in birds. And as our work life slowed down, we started a website, flyinglessons.us, where a lot of these photos and our writing was published, and then eventually started writing for newspapers and magazines, and that's what led us to the book. One of the underlining themes is the relationship between people and birds. And one of our unavoidable conclusions is that Americans love birds until they get in our way. Over the past century, and you'll be familiar with this as well, the fortunes of North America's birdscapes have swung, back and forth. Whole segments of species have been threatened and at times pushed to the brink of extinction. And the thing to remember, and that we want to emphasize as we get into this, is that each of these times Americans have stepped forward to save them, going back to the early 1900s when we passed the first laws to stop the slaughter of birds like herons and egrets and spoonbills. And then again in the 1930s, when ducks and geese, partly because of the drought of the time of the Dust Bowl, were nearly wiped out, and a whole group of game bird aficionados came forward and figured out what has since become the most successful conservation effort in the country. And then again in the 60s and 70s, when we realized that bald eagles and ospreys and condors were disappearing because of DDT, we passed the Endangered Species Act, founded the Environmental Protection Agency, and an environmental awareness really built up in those times. Today, we're facing another round of this. The crisis is different and deeper than in the past in many ways. We recently have seen the most significant avian research in decades. That came about when a group of 7 different research groups led by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology in upstate New York figured out for the first time how to count birds. Before that, it was always guesswork. I mean, we had rough ideas of when things were going well and not well, but it was never possible to actually count birds until they figured out ways of combining the traditional annual counts that have been going on for 50 years, along with new technologies, most importantly, weather radar, which is designed to count raindrops, but can also be used calculate it to be able to count birds. They put all this together and figured out that we have lost over the last half century 3 billion birds. I'm sure many of you heard about this research when it came out in 2019. And this was a profound discovery, but it also got into a lot of detail that we think showed ways that this whole issue can be confronted. It raised all kinds of questions in our minds too, as the obvious thing. What is being done to respond to this? What could be done that isn't being done? Where is all this leading? There's so much written about birds, right? Wonderful books on iconic species, from eagles to owls. There's 2 new owl books out just now. There's tons of guides. There's magnificent photo books, but what it seemed to be missing to us was a deep look at what's being done to try to save birds that are under these kind of pressures. And we realized that, and we thought the best way to research this was to get out onto the front lines to see what's being done. And it so happened that we had a 23-foot Airstream trailer that's happens to be called a flying cloud appropriately. And we converted it into a mobile office. If you don't count the bed, it's about 50 square feet altogether. And let me just tell you that this photo makes it look better than it really is. It's it's a wide angle lens. I think this friend of ours took it. It is pretty crowded, and we put everything into this, and we took off. And we started in our home in Raleigh, North Carolina. We traveled south through the South, and ended up in Florida for a while. We went across the country through the Southwest, across to Wyoming, spent time in California. And we stopped for a while in California, flew to Hawaii, came back, went back across the country. Today, we wanted to sort of touch on a few of the many stories to give you a sense of what the rescue of North America's birds are up against, and how fascinating and complex this work is. And most importantly, what are the prospects for having real impact? This wisp of a bird is the Florida Grasshopper Sparrow, and it's the target of this sort of desperate scientific intervention after it dropped to just 44 remaining birds. That made it the most endangered bird on the mainland, right on the edge of disappearing. So this is the first story we tell in the book, how scientists got together and managed to coax this bird back into health by first breeding chicks in kind of a laboratory setting, and then planting them back on the prairie where they live. These are scientists walking out there with those little boxes that have birds in them, and then releasing them to the prairie, and gradually watching over them like helicopter parents. And slowly but surely, the population has begun to rebuild. It's in many ways, it's a very encouraging story, but it's also a worrisome one, because so much of our work to save birds is taking place on the far edge of extinction, where it's most expensive and the risks are the highest. But the Florida grasshopper sparrow is about double its population, is gradually stabilizing. So that's an interesting story, we thought, to open the book with. The next story we want to share is the cerulean warbler. This is one of the many tiny little puffballs that fly back up and down the hemisphere. We followed this little guy from the Appalachian Mountains, where they breed down through the Gulf of Mexico, across to Colombia and to Ecuador. The cerulean is one of about a third of North America's birds that migrate. And this is a really important piece of the puzzle, because the migration can be such a dangerous thing. Just picture these birds having to fly across the Gulf of Mexico, all the way down, in this case, to the top part of South America. 12 different countries can be involved in this, and they all have different programs and varying amounts of funds and expertise to devote. So when you put all these countries together in North and South America, we are not doing a very good job with some of our most birds under the most pressure, and yet it's critically important that these birds get attention. They're what represent a huge piece of this migration up in north and south. The cerulean is just one of birds. Here are some of the others. That, of course, the prothonotary warbler, this little glowing golden bird, almost, if you've ever seen one of them. This is the grosbeak. He's just arrived. This photo we took in Texas. He had just arrived back from South America, eating so voraciously that you could get really close and get a photo like this. The hooded warbler, one of the smallest and most beautiful. Of course, the painted bunting, kind of think of him as a Rembrandt of birds. And then when they're in South America, these birds are joining a cast of characters that's almost 3 times as many birds in South as there are in North. This is one of the toucans, toucanet, all kinds of tanagers. This is a tanager, is called a masked flower piercer, and then, of course, all kinds of hummingbirds. Look at the tail on this guy. So one of the things we try to get across is how important the migratory birds are, and how difficult it is to try to address this. But there is some progress being made. I think in many ways, North and South America are realizing for the first time that they really need to work together in order to be able to confront the challenges that are involved here. The next bird we want to talk about is the Florida scrub jay. One of the biggest challenges for birds, of course, is how do they thrive in an ever diminishing chunks of habitat, and that's particularly true for the scrub jay, which lives in the sort of inland areas of Florida, and 90% of the scrubland, this is arid, sandy soil in the middle of the state, has disappeared because it's good also for theme parks and homes and businesses. So 90% of that habitat is gone, as is 90% of the population. And so what's happened is the study is underway to try to figure out how do you make the very most of the remaining land. It's a fascinating project that we go into in depth, and they figured out how to gradually stabilize the scrub jay by how exactly do you cure the land? What do they need? How do you create corridors between chunks of that land? It's one of the most studied birds there are in North America, and it's looking a little more promising than it had been. Here are a couple of other pictures of scrub jays, one in flight. The next bird we wanted to talk about is the California spotted owl. This is the subject of the world's largest project using the science of sound to rescue birds. The spotted owl lives way up in the Sierra Nevada mountains in places that are really remote and vast. And that makes it really difficult to figure out, well, how do you protect birds when they're scattered over all this impassable land? What the scientists have figured out how they can set up recorders all across what amounts to millions of acres of forest land, and record where the owls are, that enables them to figure out where the populations are, what's attacking them, and how they can protect them. The spotted owl, of course, is the cousin of the northern spotted owl, which in Washington and Oregon a generation ago was really the most calamitous of conservation. Everything went wrong with that story, and both the northern spotted owl and the lumber industry has suffered as a result. In California, they're trying to put a different ending on this story, and it seems so far to be working. The largest and most unusual conservation project in the country is in Hawaii. And researchers are trying to figure out how to save the last of the native forest birds like this iiwi, the honey creeper. Here is a Akea polau, another. Look at the beak on this. Its beak is evolved over time precisely to be able to dig into the branches of trees to get the larvae that it needs to survive. And so you see all kinds of really interesting beaks on these birds. This is a palila. And what's happening in Hawaii, which is really the capital of extinction, because so many invasive plants and animals and insects have taken over the island. On the coast, it looks like paradise, but in the middle of the island where the wildlife is, there's all these pressures on these birds, and they've lost already 2/3 of the native birds in Hawaii. And now 15 of the 17 remaining honey creepers are losing out to a form of malaria that is spread by mosquitoes. If this continues to happen, these birds will be gone, and it will be one of the most dramatic losses in this whole overall story. What's happening in Hawaii is that scientists have figured out how to create a version of the mosquito that they're going to release across the innards of the key islands that will mate with the existing mosquitoes that spread the malaria. It gets a little complicated here, and try to blunt the spread of this disease. It's going to start unfolding later this year. It's really a fascinating piece. Look at the dimensions of where we need to sometimes go to save birds. And so that's one of the stories to keep an eye on. We tell it in some depth in the book. This is the red-cockaded woodpecker, and many of you, I think, will probably be familiar with this story. This bird looked doomed just a few decades ago, but what rescued it is none other than the U.S. military. And what's happened in the country as it's developed, military bases have become kind of islands of undisturbed land, and as a result, home to nearly 500 species of rare birds, animals, insects, and plants. And so as the country committed to trying to save endangered species like this woodpecker, military commanders were none too interested in trying to play nursemaid to a bunch of birds. This all sort of came to a head in Fort Bragg, now Fort Liberty, where they were driving tanks through the woodpecker habitat, just willy-nilly, building new barracks on nesting grounds. And finally, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife stepped forward, stopped training at the world's largest military base, and that forced the Department of Defense to say, okay, we've got to confront this. And since then, they have become a model for how to use research and to commit the kind of resources that are needed to save birds like this one. And this is none too easy of a bird to try to save. The red-cockaded woodpecker is the pickiest bird by far that you'll ever want to see. It carves its cavity where it lives out of the longleaf pine that has to be 100 years or so old, and the tree has to be dying but not yet dead. And it can take them as long as 10 years to build that cavity, because the sap that is part of what they need there takes so long to drain. So they have to keep coming back and forth. So the birds will peck a little bit and then leave and come back a year later and peck some more. This did not give them enough time to build the nests that they need in a time when the number of trees like this were being diminished. So it looked like this bird was going to disappear. And that's when military scientists figured out how to create artificial cavities that could be installed in these trees in one afternoon. So they create this thing, plug it into the tree. They did that across 15 military bases in the southeast, which is where the woodpecker is. And gradually now this bird's population is stabilizing. It's about to be downlisted on the endangered species list 25 years ahead of schedule. And so it's sort of like government housing for these birds that have saved them. So those are the stories that we wanted to share with you. Mostly these travels 25,000 miles, as Mina mentioned, has been a great adventure. But not always. I'll have to say that Beverly and I spent our lives behind desks, and we're getting a little bit older, as you can probably tell, and suddenly we found ourselves following people who think nothing of walking 10 miles up a mountain, and dealing with bears and elk and wild boar, no issue for them. And it seemed like we were always wearing the wrong kind of shoes. I'll tell you one little story. We went looking for the ivory-billed woodpecker, the iconic bird that hasn't actually been seen since 1944, and has been in the news lately about whether it still exists or not. We hooked up with the main group that's been looking for the bird. We went out to the swamps of Louisiana, snake-infested swamps, I might add. And the first morning we went out there, our leader had on hip waders, these leather chaps and he was carrying a machete, and I got right in behind him, and Beverly was behind me, and we took off. But after a few minutes, the scientist, Steve Latta, turned around and said, by the way, it's usually the third person that gets bit. And quickly, Beverly jumped into the second place, and I was in the third place. I guess I forgot to mention that we just had regular boots on. But anyway, we had all kinds of really interesting encounters with folks, and it really brought home in so many ways that the work that's being done to save these birds is arduous, tough stuff, none too easy in many remote places, and gradually trying to turn things around is some of the hardest work that you can do. The second half of the book, we look at the broader issues that are surrounding the future of birds in North America. What's going to help not just individual species, as we've been talking about, but the wider expanse of birds. And there's good and bad news on this. We devote a chapter to the realization among a group of ranchers and farmers that making room for birds is good, not just for wildlife, but it tends to lead to a more productive and profitable ranch. This is a family in southwestern Kansas that has figured out how to make room for birds at the same time as they have a profitable ranch. And this whole concept of sustainable agriculture is a key piece of what may help to save birds, because farmlands are such a big factor in erasing that habitat. If you can coexist, it can make a huge difference. I mentioned the 3 billion bird report, where the group of scientists figured out how to calculate the number of birds. They got together afterwards and decided, well, it's not good enough just to figure out the number. We want to get together and put together a group that's trying to rethink conservation. And this is Pete Mara, who's heading this group, trying to figure out how to put more research prowess on birds earlier in the process, not waiting until they're at the final stages of their existence, but to confront things that can be done in all kinds of different ways, in habitat and protections earlier in the game. And this is John Fitzpatrick, probably the most eloquent voice on behalf of birds, the former director of the Cornell Lab, now the director emeritus. Another really important lesson that we found and spend some time with is the success, as we mentioned a little earlier, on game birds. This is an area where it's going completely against the grain. A group of hunters of ducks, as well as other game birds, got together starting almost 80 years ago and said, how are we going to fund conservation to protect birds that we want to go hunting? And they created, of course, organizations like Ducks Unlimited that figured out how to put in place taxes on ammunition, guns, bows, and arrows, that have funded, at this point, I believe, $18 billion in protecting land and research, and particularly focusing on breeding areas, mostly in the North and in Canada. And game birds are up 50% at a time when almost all other species are down. What that shows is that if we want to, we can save save birds. Why isn't that same concept, we ask in the book, being applied to songbirds? Why don't we put together some sort of tax on, say, bird seed and binoculars? And $4 billion in bird seed is sold in this country each year. Would not be willing to put a little bit aside so that we do have the same impact for songbirds as we have for for game birds? Here's a goose, beautiful mallard. These birds are doing well, and there's a model there that can be used very effectively. The book also lays out what stands in the way. At the top of the list, habitat loss, is followed by the ambivalence the country has always had about devoting resources to conservation needs. And the fact is that our state and federal conservation system is not keeping up with the pace of the loss of bird populations. It's pretty clear, at least up to this point, that the leadership for this is not going to come from our political leaders, our government agencies, as it has in the past, as we mentioned earlier, the things that were put into place. This year, the Endangered Species Act turns 50, and it's become so underfunded that the list is, as you probably know, is backed up. It can take years and sometimes decades for a species just to be reviewed to figure out whether it needs. The system we have built over time, over that 100 years or so, is really the world's model for how to take care of our birds and other wildlife, but we've been unwilling to consider how to adjust it for modern times when things are changing. And one great example of this is pending right before Congress now. The Restoring America's Wildlife Act would do a lot to help fund the funds that are missing and are needed for birds other than game birds. It passed the House last year, but is stalled in the Senate. After all those interviews, we come away, thinking that the leadership will have to come from other places. And that may include, the nonprofits, which are very powerful: Cornell Lab, Audubon, American Bird Conservancy, Ducks Unlimited. If they were to get together more effectively, and they're not working especially well together, they could have a huge impact. And philanthropies that are getting more and more interested in the climate change issue could have impact on birds as well. Now, the other significant thing is the public. We are seeing a time when there's more interest on the part of the public in birds than ever before. We all know that when the pandemic kept us at home, suddenly we looked out and saw many people saw birds, and for the first time realized, well, this is really pretty interesting. The number of birds followers has skyrocketed since then and has held steady since then. A great example of this are in the tools that Cornell has produced. 900,000 people now are using eBird, almost a million people that are tracking the birds that they see, and that is then turned into conservation research that can help figure out where the problems are. The Merlin Bird ID, if you haven't used that, you probably have if you're interested in birds, but if you haven't, look it up now. It's a free app that can help you figure out what the birds are that you're hearing at the same time as you're contributing to conservation. So we come away from all of these interviews and this travel feeling mostly hopeful that this country can and will take advantage of this really unique moment, a time when the knowledge of birds is deeper than ever before, and the power of avian research is really accelerating. And we're seeing the responsibility going beyond just the scientists and wildlife professionals to farmers and ranchers and birders and private landowners. Let me switch off the slides because I think we're just about done. I'll leave that up just for a second as I wrap up here. Can't tell you how many times we heard the expression, the canary in the coal mine in these interviews, talking about the role that birds play because they're so sensitive to their environment. This, of course, goes back to an era when canaries were used in mines to be able to detect when the air was under pressure, was going to go bad. But today birds, are telling us in very specific terms that we need to respond to the changes in this broader environmental picture. And this is obviously, it's a time to be listening to them. And so those are our thoughts, and thank you for listening. Let me get rid of these slides and stop screen sharing and get into a discussion about all this.
Yeah, I want to remind everybody that's here to go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A, and I will moderate them with Anders. But I have a question that is, I'm a little bit hesitant to ask because it's probably not super popular, but a lot of people don't understand ecology and the great circle of life and all of that. So why does this matter? Why does it matter that we have so many species of birds? Like we have, even though you said like 3 billion birds had died or were no longer, there's still billions of birds. So like why does this matter?
Yeah, and I touched briefly on this in early on, talking about the services that birds play. And of course, you are already getting into a key part of the answer, which is that every layer of wildlife and the environment serves another. So if we start to pull these pieces out, then there are results that we're not even sure what they're going to be. But I'll tell you one story that's pretty interesting, and that is in India and Pakistan. There was a drug that got out into the land that killed off all kinds of vultures. It was an anti-inflammatory drug that cows used, and the vultures would eat it, and then they died. So most of the vultures for a time disappeared from India and parts of Pakistan. And the result of that was the spread of rabies went at all sorts of places. Thousands of people died at a cost, I think it's in the book, of the $30 billion of economic impact. Now, if we need to go that far to make the argument that there are consequences for when we mess up the environment so much that a whole segment of in this case birds are gone, and then that's one piece of it. And I think we also try to make the argument that that particularly in North America and in the United States, we have this amazing natural resources that has created what this country is, and that includes the wildlife, the birds as a big part of that. If we lose that, we are significantly diminished. And part of the argument that we're hearing and we put forward from other people, mostly in the book, is that it isn't that hard to protect them, but our awareness of them, we just hadn't paid attention, and all of a sudden we sort of woke up one day and realized, look what we've done. The climate challenges are enormous, but the bird issues, which are one piece of that story, are a concrete piece where you can see specific things that can be done. Individuals can do many things we'll talk about maybe in a minute that could have an impact on this. So those are some of the thoughts that we cover in the book.
So I guess the thought for me is that, oh, birds are pretty, but they actually have, each and every species has some function in our ecology.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And again, the pollination issue right alone, just look at that. If you lose pollination, then these plants won't operate on, farms won't work. It's a very important piece of this. And there's a really interesting story in the book about how Walmart has recognized that birds are an indicator of the quality of pollination in the farms that they rely on. So they're using birds, watching birds, to be able to determine, yes, these folks are doing a good job of keeping a healthy environment, and those are the people we want to buy from.
Oh,
I've
wow.
sort of shortened that story a lot, but it's an interesting one.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll get into that in a minute, but because I want to ask Judith's question of, do the colored bands on the bird legs impact the attraction of mates positively or negatively?
Yeah.
I think that was early on.
Yeah. Well, there's some controversy about not so much the bands because those are so small, they don't seem to have impact. The tracking devices are what allows us to follow birds where they go and try to figure out where in the migration path they might have troubles. And there's occasionally times when that seems to work against the bird's ability to fly, not to fly in general, but that holds them back. There's standards, very strict standards for how much weight a bird can handle. It seems to be watched pretty closely, so it's not a big issue that we ran into.
Oh, good to know.
Yeah.
So again, if you guys have any questions, put them in the Q&A. But I'm curious. I want to go back a little bit on your own history with Beverly. So
Yeah.
the interest in birds is a very specific. It's very specific. So did you meet each other in something that was bird related, or did you guys get together and then we're like, oh, we love birds?
No, we've been together a long time before birds came into our lives. I mean, she was a little bit further ahead of me on this, but it was really more that we were reaching a point in where we were living in Washington, where we were really not exposed at all to any kind of wildlife. Our kids had left the house, blown the coop, so to speak, and so we just started getting out of town and camping in the woods, and that's when we sort of began to get tuned into birds. And as the more we learned, and I think this is part of what we found, is the more you learn about birds and come to appreciate them, the more you eventually care about, well, what can we do and what needs to be done to try to protect this gift that we have.
Mhm. So I want to go back to what you had said about what can we do individually, not as part of a grassroots organization or politically or anything like that, but like what can we do in our own backyards to make sure that we're doing what we can?
Sure, and it's a great question, and thank you for asking that. There's an afterwards in the book where there are, I think now 22 different specific things that people can do, and this is an area, where an individual can make a huge difference with things like putting in native plants. I mean, birds need the native plants that they grew up with over millions of years. This is what they came to depend on: trees, plants. It's like suddenly you didn't have any of the things you're used to around you. You don't function. So the native plants, if you plant in your backyard, will have a lot of impact. Avoid pesticides and keep your cats indoors. Cats kill I believe the number 2.3 billion birds a year. Think about that. That's just a huge churn that cats, if they're kept indoors as they should be, or a catio, as many people will use. It's not just feral cats; it's cats, outdoor cats. A big piece of that. And then there's sort of the next layer of things that can be done. There's a really positive trend underway to turning lights out in cities just during the high migration points. And this allows birds to avoid being confused or smashing into buildings as much. And it's starting to spread. I believe the last figure I saw was about 30 different cities are turning lights off during key migration periods.
Mm-hmm.
Push for those things in your town. So the afterward goes into all sorts of things, that I mentioned briefly, the cattle ranchers. There's now bird-friendly beef, as there is bird-friendly coffee. What is that? That's when a farm or a grower agrees to do the kind of things that protect birds and make it possible for birds to coexist with birds in exchange for a status that makes their product a bird-friendly product. And maple syrup can be bird-friendly. That's a new trend that allows you to support birds in the marketplace with what you buy.
I will look for that. Actually, Patty had asked about the cats, but her specific question was, are there any initiatives or anything to have people keep their cats indoors that you know of?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's constant reminders from people to in organizations to recognize that the cat issue is real. A lot of people that love their cats and their dogs. Now, dogs are a somewhat different issue. That's a matter of keeping them on leashes on beaches.
Mm,
But you know, these are predators in effect. We don't want
mm,
to think of them that way. We love our cats. We love cats, but by letting them roam free outdoors, they will kill birds. It's built into them, and so there's no. I think the important thing is for people to recognize that this is an issue, not deny the facts on this, which is a lot of controversy every time. We went and talked to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife folks in Washington in interviews, and when we brought up cats, they said, "Oh, don't bring up cats," because they get so much pressure from cat lovers. Just recognize that this is a real issue.
hmm Right. Well, I was thinking if you have a cat that's declawed, which they don't want you to do anymore, which is good, that cat is almost definitely going to be indoors. So like if they're not declawing them, then they're more likely to be outside.
They can still catch birds.
Oh,
That,
really?
oh, sure. I mean,
Yeah,
they can, you know. So the issue is to keep them from being outside.
got it.
Yeah.
Patricia, who is in our environmental book club, says
Yeah.
the things that you can do section in your book was very helpful. Thank you for including it. And Amy asks, can you talk to the issue of bird strikes on buildings and bird-friendly architecture?
Yeah, yeah. So this is a version of the same issue, is that as you know, as the high-rise buildings have spread all across the world, this is a dangerous thing for birds, and it also applies in our homes. You know, birds will smash into the plate glass windows that you have. You can put up little symbols on them so they can see that this is not, they think is something they can fly through.
Mm,
Architecture, which can mark the high-rise buildings, and it's not going to take care of the problem, we're told, but it can diminish it, is an important piece of it. Federal buildings are moving toward this. That's a positive sign, but we still have these huge, you know, number of high-rise buildings that are causing an estimated billion bird collisions every year. So it's an area where a lot more needs to be done.
mhm. And Patty wants a follow-up question of that. Is there any mandates that are happening for buildings to put things on their windows so that birds don't fly into them?
There's not a mandate. I mean, it's not something that can be legislated. Federal buildings can be, but there is not a mandate that requires that.
Mhm. Um, VGO says Rachel Carson woke the world up to DDT and the consequences, bringing the laws around to ban it. Now, feeding the world brings the grim reality of having to use chemicals on insects and other issues. What is your take on this, and what is being done to limit the poisons in America and Europe?
Well, this is a very broad question, and I can sort of briefly say that we we have a history of releasing chemicals to market before they've really been tested. And so there, you know, there's pressure to try to rectify that. EPA, like 2 years ago, admitted that it had failed to do the kind of testing that's required by law to
Mhm.
try to understand what's happening with, you know, particularly those the pesticides and insecticides that are clearly having an impact on a lot of species. So I think the main thing is to push for the kind of testing that tells us not just, you know, is there a danger, but how to use appropriately. We're not going to stop using any pesticides on farms and ranches, but they can be diminished, and individuals can avoid them, and that's where an awful lot, I think, of the progress can be made. So this is an area where, yes, we feed the world, and we're not going to stop doing that, and we are looking for ways as a country to expand food production. But there's a matter of moderation and testing that we have not done a very good job with. And the DDT story is an example that the neonicotinoids, which is the next group of chemicals that are now under question, call it, they are the most widely used neonics for short chemicals in agriculture, and it's not clear what the impact is that they're having. So this is where research needs to be done ahead of time to try to know, well, what are we dealing with here?
I have a follow-up question to that, which is about urban farming. A lot of it's indoors, it's soilless, it's water and nutrients. So does that help or take away from birds being part of that circle of planting and farming?
I don't know if I have an answer for that. I mean, logic would tell you that it would have less impact than road crops and ranches, but I don't really know the answer to that.
Okay, yeah, it's kind of a weird one.
Yeah.
Karen says, do cell towers affect the birds or windmills very much?
Yeah, those are two separate issues. It doesn't look like cell towers have an impact, but turbines are a big issue. And we're, there's an irony built into that part of the challenge because, the growth of both solar and turbines is an important alternative for energy use, but we're doing it without standards for placement and protection. So we're not sort of like the pesticides. We haven't done the research to know what migratory paths would be particularly dangerous for birds. And we're in a huge rush to put turbines as everywhere we can. So there needs to be a permitting process that just recognizes, again, we're not going to not use, I don't think, turbines. It's an important developing energy source, but we need to know where the wind that powers the turbines also powers the birds. So you need to think about where there's places where that you can mitigate this. With eagles that are have additional protection under the law, there are provisions put into place for permitting and placement of turbines. It does not apply to other species, and it ought to. And we need to have a cohesive policy that's in place before this huge growth that we know is coming in turbines. So those are two different issues that we heard about, and we're not confronting the turbine questions very well.
I had a question about something you said earlier about the thing stuck in the Senate, the legal
America's Wildlife Act. Yeah.
Yes. What can we do to move that along?
Well, if you look at Audubon, American Bird Conservancy, the nonprofits make it possible for you to very easily put pressure on your representatives on issues that you care about. And this is one of them where this is a sad story because this really came out of a true bipartisan effort that was a decade in research to figure out how do we bring better balance to our conservation funding. And energy companies and game bird supporters and academics and bird groups all got together and came up with this legislation that eventually passed the House, but has not gotten through the Senate. And like a lot of things in Congress, is not even being reviewed right now. It may have lost its opportunity. So putting pressure on that is a very good use of time if that's something you care about.
I do. Karen asked the question that I actually love. Can birds be cloned to save a species?
Yes, maybe. So there's a whole section of the book where we look at the efforts to de-extinct the passenger pigeon. So the passenger pigeon went extinct in 1903 over hunting and disappeared. It had been the chicken of the era, had been the most prevalent bird. And so this group called Revive and Restore is working on trying to clone the passenger pigeon and bring it back. So far, there's barriers with birds because their reproduction is through eggs. It makes it more complicated than the cloning of other species, which is taking place. They've cloned horses, they've cloned ferrets, and so this group now is working on trying to clone birds. It's controversial in the sense that they don't want to send the message that, well, don't worry, we can clone these species and bring them back, so don't get too upset when we're losing our wildlife. And yet the work that companies like this are doing are also looking sort of at the inner biology of birds to understand, well, what kind of things might be done, for instance, in Hawaii, where they're susceptible to this avian malaria. Is it possible to edit their genes, in effect, in the same way we're doing in medicine now, to protect them from diseases like that? So that's a very promising thing we touch on in the book. And I think it's a few years away, but maybe not more than 10, according to the scientists that are working on it.
Okay, so I have time for one last question, which is mine. Did
Yeah.
you or Beverly, which one of you is a photographer? Because the pictures are just gorgeous in your book.
Yeah. Thanks so much. I'm the photographer, but Beverly is the spotter, so she sees a lot, and we work together on this. And I will say one thing about photography, which I think is, there's just loads of, let's call us amateur photographers, in the sense that the birds as a photography, great challenge. And the work of all these folks getting out on the internet and elsewhere puts you into place to be able to see birds in a light that you can't otherwise see. So there's real value, I think, in the photography and videography that's taking place to try to put people there. And the more we see and care about birds, I think the more we're willing to do the kind of things that will make sure they're around for another 100 million years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the visual is just so stunning, it really captures your eye, and then you want to learn more about it. So like for me, like as more of a visual learner, I really appreciated the artistry of the photography.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate it. And I
Well,
appreciate
Anders,
the chance to talk with you. It's been a real pleasure.
yeah, I really appreciate your time. I know we had to switch the date a couple times, and I hope I hope to meet Beverly someday. But thank you very much for this.
Well, and I'll just add, so our website is flyinglessons.us, and a lot of information there, in addition to information on the book, is available. We write about birds and all different kind of, the concept of it is that the birds have lessons to share with us. What we're learning from the birds is the concept. So join us, sign up for our newsletter, and it comes out every couple of weeks. And if you're interested in the book, you can get it almost anywhere. From Amazon to local bookstores to the library.
Yeah. You have lots of choices. So thank you all for being here tonight. Anders, have a wonderful night, and happy birding.
Thanks very much.
Good night,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Thank you.